Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Pronago. This is Prototype. We are on episode 54, and maybe I should have saved this title for the next episode because it would have been 55, and there's 5 in the title, and that would have been 3 5s. But anyway, 500 frauds, that's what we're all about. What is that title in reference to? Well, by the end of this week, we will almost certainly be hitting 500 Discord server members. If you want to bump those numbers up faster, you can click the link in the description and check us out there. It's a very exciting time to be part of the No Frauds Club. It's a very exciting time to be part of Cause Monarchy and its crazy ambitious development goals. And we are going to continue with those as we progress down the sort of tech tree, if you will, of StarCraft editing, of modding, of game design, etc., of RTS design in many ways. That's kind of how I like to think about it. Obviously, Cause Monarchy is the most ambitious project ever made within StarCraft. It's kind of like a whole new game within StarCraft's engine. You can check it out. It has its own launcher, installer, etc., and for the most part, it's pretty damn good at what it does. So you should be able to just get everything running in one click. Could you believe it? And of course, if you have any issues, contact us. Please let us know so that we can document what those fixes are, etc., etc. Let's talk about a bunch of things. What are we going to cover in this episode? Well, as is customary for the show intro, I basically go over a quick table of contents. We're going to kick things off talking about the progress made on the Zerg tutorial. Got some exciting stuff there. We're also going to cover Throneroom results. That's the Throneroom stage of Acropolis number 1, as well as previewing the second round matchups. And then we are going to cover some concepts that I have for additional balance adjustments that I've only told a few select people like Neblime and Veek and stuff. So we're going to be getting into some exciting territory here, shedding some more light on some thoughts that I've had for in making the game even better and even more exciting. And of course, we'll close out with some coffee questions. We actually have, let me count them real quick, 6 coffee questions this episode, this week, I should say. If you want to get in on that action, then you can take a look at the coffee link in the bottom left, because that is where you can support us. You can send us money. And if you send us money on a monthly basis, one of the things you get access to is a channel in the Discord server where you can ask questions every time I record one of these episodes, and I do that once a week. You also get to ask myself and Veek7, my brother-in-arms, my Chromie, as I call him, Crow Homie, you know. He is the guy that I do the episode of Crow's Nest with. So that is a duo podcast instead of a solo one. So whenever we get around to recording one of those, we can, of course, take your questions there as well. All right. Let's get into it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very excited about the Zerg tutorial. I'm excited for it. A couple of different reasons. One of them is definitely the fact that soon it will be done, and then I can work on other things that I'm even more excited about. So there's some like rub off, tangential, connected excitement there. But it's in a good way. It's not in a way where I'm like, oh, I just want this to be over. I'm very highly motivated to move on to other things. But I've also been very much enjoying the progress made on the Zerg tutorial, because it means that I've finally kind of like put down a concrete version. I've concretized this idea of what the Zerg will be like. And I've said a lot of things about that, and I've talked a lot of smack about the existing ways that Zerg are presented and Zerg-like things are presented in other mediums. Obviously, you look at StarCraft 1, and then we're going okay, and then obviously Kerrigan got infested, and then everything became very human-like, and I didn't like that at all. There was infighting and this petty stuff, and the, Cerebrits had these like weird personality defects and obvious like strategical blunders and stuff, and it wasn't really easily explicable. And the Overmind talked all Bible-like, and that's kind of interesting and neat in some ways, but it felt like it was combating with the theme of the unknowable, cannot understand this great force of nature that happens to also be biological and swarming. That's sort of how I always envisioned Zerg. And so I'm sure some people thought that the way that the Zerg were presented in StarCraft 1, or maybe even, God forbid, StarCraft 2, was actually just fine. But I am personally somebody who thinks that there's a lot more that you can maybe achieve. However, I am changing them into being something completely different in many ways. I mean, there's still a hive mind, right? But there's like multiple hives, if you will, or multiple hive minds. So you can kind of think about it like each tendril is its own version of what the Overmind led. So instead of there being one dominant force, at least that you're aware of in the narrative of the campaigns, as it's presented to you in the tutorial and other sources, instead of there being one dominant force across the whole cosmos, it's more like maybe coevolution, or like they've splintered off at some point and created their own tendrils, and those tendrils had different genuses and stuff like that, and they had different evolutions, and so that would be how they get different units, because for those who don't know, that each tendril is like its own faction, and each faction tends to have somewhere of, from a conceptual level, each faction will eventually have like 6 to 8 new units, basically, as like a general guideline. So with all that said, what do we have from the Zerg tutorial? Well, in the Zerg tutorial, we have to tutorialize the game mechanics, the tech trees, the things that are different about each race, but we also have to tutorialize the world, have to welcome new players, new people who are newly interested in this sort of thing to the world of Cosmonarchy, which is set in the Chrysilian sector, very far away from the Caprulu sector. So you can always read up more about that. There's actually a link in the, I guess I can put the link in the description to the Chrysilian sector. I was actually linking it to somebody recently, and also for the what do you call it, the Cosmonarch's Compass, which I did do recently as well. So we'll say Chrysilian sector write-up, and that'll be a link in the description. By the way, if you guys hear me typing, I'm almost always typing either something for the description of the video, like a link, or I'm typing in the description for timestamps. So if you ever hear that, that's what's going on. It's just a lot easier for me to do that in the moment. I know it might break some people's ability to focus on the dialogue or whatever, I guess the monologue in this case, so I apologize for that. But I do like to do that, and sometimes I can get away with it quietly, but not like when I'm really typing something to find it. So anyway, welcome to Chrysilian. That's what this is all about. So we're welcoming people to the new command structure of the Zerg, how we have a tendril, and each tendril has like ridiculous number, like uncountable organs, and each organ is like a brood equivalent of StarCraft 1, where it's like, that would be a player, basically. And each brood would be... And by player, I mean like a player in a game. So if you played like a campaign mission and there were 4 different Zerg enemies and they were denoted by having different colors, then that would be 4 different organs would have been on the field, as an example, right? So that's sort of what I'm getting at from there. I'm kind of like intermingling nomenclature from when you make a map and you have like, I don't know if you conceptualize it in that kind of environment. Like as a player, maybe this can be something people can comment about. If you've played a lot of StarCraft custom content or just RTS games in general, do you think about like, oh, somebody has a different player color on them, that means they're a different player? Because my basic knowledge of the way that games are made makes me think that that's what's happening there. And so I'm always thinking like, okay, that's a different player. So like, for example, if this RTS game has upgrades, then that player will get upgrades at a different time than the other guy, even if they're the same race. So there's like a high probability that I'll click on that guy's unit and he'll have like level 1 upgrades and the other guy will have level 2, or like that guy will have upgrade. I don't know if it's like Age of Empires type game or something, and then they upgrade like their unit. Well, okay, that guy will have the upgraded unit first, and then the other guy will still be on the old version or whatever. So stuff like that I feel like is kind of intuitive to me, but maybe that's like me getting super lost in the sauce, and everybody, like many other people, don't think that. So anyway, leave a comment if you're so inclined to tell me what you think about that. I feel like it's really obvious from my time in mapping and level design, but it's probably not as obvious as I'm thinking, but maybe it is pretty obvious. I don't know. Anyway, the Zerg tutorial is shaping up. We are introducing people to the new setting, and in that setting, you have the tendril, you've got the organs, you've got the sort of like this idea of tissues and cells. So tissues are basically like another word for structures, and they are further segmented into 3 distinct categories, because 3. Technically, there's like one that's kind of like a cheat category that's technically like 2 separate ones, but it's basically the same thing, so it's fine. There's chondra, Chondra, sort of like mitochondria, but chondra, so it's like a little bit of a made-up word, but you can immediately sort of understand where it's from. So chondra is the production. And that's basically, Hatterosk, Larvosk, etc. Then there's Caesiant, which obviously Larvosk Caesiant is technically a thing, like Oxal Caesiant is also a thing, but like that would be a Chondra Caesiant, that would be like some weird hybrid thing. That's anything that's also including the Excisant. So Caesiant would include the gas construction stuff, as well as, of course, the replacement or renamed version of the Creep Colony, the Kagrant Caesiant. So anything mutated therein is a Caesiant, and that's basically some sort of utility cell for defense and stuff like that. Then we have the actual node, the tech nodes and stuff, right? So there's the supreme nodes, which are the Iris and the Aviform as well, the Austal Aviform. And then there's all the tech nodes, which are just like, they were just referred to as nodes. So that's what tissues are. So there's like, I get, you could probably think of like the nodes as something, you could probably maybe further divide that instead of it being tissue. Like maybe tissue is the, maybe the Caesiants would be the tissues, and then there would be like I'm trying to figure out what muscle would be. Maybe muscle is the production, or chondra, right? Chondra would be muscle, and then tissue would be the Kagrants and like the Caesiants, and then there'd be oh man, I just had it. There was something else that I was going to use for the nodes, but I can't remember what it was. It was like nerves or something like that. Anyway, that you could imagine going a layer deeper than that, but we've already decided on the verbiage, so that's fine. And then of course there's cells. So cells are the combatants, right? So the cells would be any unit essentially. And that could be utility cells like the Ovoleth, right? It's a vital cell is what it's referred to as in the tutorial. There's also, of course, combat cells, right? And, I was thinking about calling them immune cells, but I felt like that was a little bit misleading because the other word for immune, you had to also factor in that you're like, we don't have a translator or anything, so it's not like we have logistics that can do the localization. So we would have to deal with the fact that, like, if somebody just hears the word immune, maybe the only way they know that word is not from the immune system, or that's the secondary way. They first think of them as like invulnerable or something, right? Like it's immune to damage. Like that's not what it means at all. So I decided to go with combat cells. I think that's fine. And then there's also the what's the other one? Just worker cells, right? So there's like an introduction. This allows us, for the script writing perspective, to have some in-character and in-universe dialogue that actually makes sense. So when you first start the game, you hear from yourself, the organ that you are playing as, says worker cells to harvest, hatching chondra to gestate, combat cells to conquer. This is known. And a lot of this dialogue ends with this is known. And because the idea is basically that the sort of what would you call it? Evolutionary, like, oh man, there's a term for that when it's, I guess, evolved, right? So the evolved sort of impulses and instincts that a creature would have are basically being spoken aloud for the benefit of the player is like a translation for the thought. So these instincts and these like that's basically how the Zerg communicate, is through this sort of instinctual network that they have. And so there's these impulses that go through and communicate these sort of biological imperatives that are embedded within the organ. And that is how that gets communicated to all of the attached cells, the connected cells. And a lot of that is, if you want to know like the deep lore stuff, a lot of that is actually going to be communicated through the Kagra. And so the reason why you need to gestate your cells upon the Kagra, so that or have them already have been gestated from Kagra, in the case of like if you move off Kagra and then gestate on the open ground with like a mutated, you take your Hydra and mutate it into a Bactylisk or whatever. You need to have some former connection to the Kagra in order for the communications and the sort of imperatives to be embedded within the cell. And so that's how they get their information. It's like a biological process. So the reason why I'm going through all this detail is basically just to say that for the long time, I didn't really have these kinds of ground truth specifics that would explain all of the differences and like how this stuff worked. And I'm not sure that Blizzard ever put too much thought into the Zerg. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I vaguely remember some lines in the manual, but the manual also had a lot of other stuff that didn't make any sense. But I think that this way of presenting the information, in a sense that it's like cloaking the biological part in like a speech thing, like that's the best way that I can imagine translating this biological impulse idea into something that is readable and legible for humans. So hopefully that stuff passes muster and doesn't feel like it's too avant-garde, because a lot of the stuff that we're going to have here is like, this is in many ways a dress rehearsal for hive mind type races and like presenting those ideas within other content in our own RTS games in the future. Now, I don't think we have any, I'm trying to think of like through Onatar and Pangea, there's not really any hive mind stuff planned. But once we get into, Xibalba, and you've got the Rosellium, and you've got Gadamemptor, and you've got the Orlithrae, there's like a bunch of cases where we have, and not all of those are hive mind cases, by the way. Most of them are, but the Rosellium aren't exactly a hive mind. It's more like a machine consensus. But the bottom line is that there has to be like a way to communicate this stuff in a context that doesn't feel like it's just for the player's benefit, because then it feels like a farce, basically. So if I have to, in some way, like feel like I'm too constrained and I like overstep the bounds and it's too convenient, or maybe it's not convenient enough and it's too weird, and then like the intended message is not communicated. I'd prefer to make that kind of mistake here than to do it in the context of our own content in the future, although I'm sure I'll make different kinds of mistakes there as well. But this is the concept that I've got going on right now. And I feel like it's pretty cool. It definitely is very different to how the Zerg were done before. There's no biblical speech. The introduction from the Pr0totype entity, which is essentially the super consciousness that is embedded within the Pr0totype tendril, right, is basically giving speech to the overriding directives of what a Zerg organ is. And at this nascent stage in the Genesis organ, which is what you're playing as, that nascent stage of the organ is basically like not yet determined what it will become. You can kind of think about it as still in some kind of embryonic stage where it's not fully birthed. And I think that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure that I'll really spend too much time trying to explore that in the future. But the idea of sort of like one of the ideas that I had for this tutorial that I did not take great lengths to explain entirely, although obviously there's some allusion to it in the briefing, but there's not that much. It's not like literally saying, hey, you're not fully solidified yet. You have to come up with what you'll be and decide what you'll be. And it's like supposedly this would be a nice way for us to like evaluate the player and then have a dialogue event that would be different depending on what happens. Although we're not doing that for this tutorial, it's out of scope, but maybe we'll add it later or something, right? But the idea of basically having the Pr0totype entity like monitor what you do and then declare what kind of organ you are at the end based on what you do in the game. So it would be like if you attack your enemy really fast and you just rush them down and kill them, then maybe you'll be an assault organ, right? If you take your sweet time, reconning the area and attempting to do your best, make your best efforts at really understanding what your enemy is doing before you counter them, then maybe you'll be more of like a seeding organ, because that's like paving the way and drawing attention and consider like a reconnaissance organ, basically, right? And then if you're somebody who like waits till the late game or like really grinds it out, then you might be more of a defensive organ, right? And so there's I think I had those ideas as immune organs, although I feel like I wrote them down somewhere. But I think I wrote them down in one of my notepad documents. I only have like 40 of them open, so it shouldn't take long for me to find them. But there's immune organ is a defensive organ, assault is an offensive one, deployed during sizable conflicts. Seeding is a small and nimble organ for reconnaissance and establishing footholds. And Genesis is where it's what you are, right? You're a fledgling organ with the ability to adapt into any role. And then Withered is a rotting, senescent, or viral organ that must be renewed or recycled. So the idea behind this, right, is that you as the Genesis organ are either going to be fodder to renew the Withered organ, or you are going to consume and recycle the Withered organ to gain its knowledge, to gain its impulses and instincts, and metabolize them in some way in order to use for the future, right? So that's kind of like the evolutionary process that we've got going on here, is either, that's probably pretty expensive, you could imagine, as like a procedure. It's fairly resource intensive to produce a new organ. And so you're either going to use that new organ to like with Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest kind of thing, to overwhelm and overcome an existing organ that has already sort of come to the end of its life cycle, or you'll renew that organ and extend its life cycle. And, it's sort of like what wins out, right? Is it the raw sort of potential, or is it the raw experience? And that's essentially what is doing battle here. So that's like the idea behind the mission. And I feel like the presentation style is very different than any other RTS mission you'll probably have played. I don't know if there's been experimentation like this in RTS levels. Maybe somebody can link me their strangest RTS level, list or something, or write like a short form list of it. I know like that would be right up Chumbeck's alley. I know he's played a lot, and I know Dynamo's played a lot, but I don't know. It's something I'm interested in. So maybe ping me in the Real Time for Real Men channel on the Discord server if you got recommendations or whatever. All right, so yeah, and then of course the other thing to note is that the Ataltrith Advisor has been completed, so we are on track with that. That's actually replaced the Zerg Advisor right now, as of recording right now, which is of course Tuesday the 23rd, and that is when we are going to be talking about pre-release having that new Zerg Advisor. I'll probably be speeding up some of the dialogue event or some of the advisor lines because they're a little bit long as they currently stand. So I'll be like grabbing long consonants and enunciations and stuff and kind of like trimming them out a little bit. It's pretty easy to do that in a non-destructive way. So it's, a lesson I've definitely learned. I actually started it off for advisors. I did that for the Mesk advisor because it's a lot easier for me to just do a retake in many respects than it is for me to say, hey, Mesk, you said this thing pretty damn well, except it's like 1.2x longer than it needs to be. Can you do it fast? Like that? Good luck. So I think if you want to just keep the same take, that's basically what you would do, right? So you just speed it up in that respect. So that's fine. All good on that front. Yeah, I'll speed those ones up and like adjust it and monitor it over time, because there's like the one where you're out of Vespene. I guess he says Vespene pretty fast, but the whole thing kind of lags a little bit on, drags on a little bit. And so I feel like it would be better if that wasn't the case. So we'll see how that one evolves over time. No pun intended there. But that is the progress on the Zerg tutorial with the Ataltrith tendril taken care of as far as the advisor is concerned. We can now deploy that. And I'll have to come up with a new portrait for the Ataltrith entity, which will also be a new Zerg advisor portrait by default. It'll be interesting to see that one in action. But there you go. Let's jump ahead. Now we can talk about the next topic, which is, of course, the Throneroom results and the preview of the next phase. And basically one of the things that I'm most excited about here is the fact that we have a really banger match for the upper semifinal number 1. But let's go over the results. So the quarterfinals are now in the past. The first one was Hamster versus Taco Cake, PVZ. The second was Neblime versus Newt, ZVT. The third was Hepsea versus Art of Turtle, PVZ. And the fourth was the Shambler versus General Anakin, PvP. So we had a nice menagerie of matchups there, although of course there was only one Terran, which is unfortunate. Even more unfortunate is that for Newt anyway, he did end up falling. He took the first game, but Neblime got the 3 after that. And obviously in Hamster's case, he dominated Taco Cake in the first 2 games, and the third one was a bit more of a contest, but still ended up going Hamster's way. And so that's how we found ourselves with Hamster versus Neblime, PVZ. Very exciting upper semifinal number 1. On the other side of the bracket, Hepsea and Art of Turtle had a 5-game set. Art of Turtle almost completing the reverse sweep upset. Hepsea narrowly edges him out, although the 5th game, I should say. The first 2 games were pretty easy for Hepsea, I felt like, and the last game was a little bit more of the same, although a bit more contest. And then Art of Turtle obviously dragged it out in the 4th game, and the 3rd game was just like a sudden kind of like, oh my god, I can't believe he did that. So it was pretty cool. I mean, the macro wins were definitely Art of Turtles, but Hepsea was able to stuff him before he could complete the comeback. So that was pretty cool. That means our lower bracket matchups look like such, right? Hepsea versus the Shambler, of course, being the upper semifinal number 2, going to be more PvP action. General Anakin was able to take a game off of the Shambler, but in the case of that, it was basically some just like dirty rushes back and forth. That was essentially it. So there weren't any particularly long games. I feel like we'll definitely have some longer ones between Shambler and Hepsea. That one is actually going to be played at 9 p.m. my time, which is in an hour from now as I check the clock. So that's kind of exciting. I'm looking forward to casting that this weekend. We will cast them on Saturday and talk to the players involved. We'll try to get the people on for at least like a short interview if they have been eliminated. I was hoping to cast the matches live, but due to people's availabilities and during the week, it seems like it's a lot more convenient for them to play even the elimination matches beforehand. So we'll get all the matches played beforehand, cast them to you, bring them to you live, and hopefully that is exciting. I do think that there's something missing if you don't cast them live as they're happening, but at the very least, the benefit of the replays is that they can probably play with the lowest possible latency, since it'll just be 2 people connected. So that's kind of neat. Anyway, Newt versus Taco Cake on the lower side of the first side of the lower bracket. Art of Turtle versus General Anakin on the other side of the general bracket. So or the general bracket. I was thinking General Anakin, the lower bracket. Maybe he'll make it the general bracket if he decides to, buckle up and smash Art of Turtle's Zerg. That would be 2 separate Protosses, and of course the Shambler, who he also fell to in groups back in the Battlement stage. Art of Turtle would have Protoss as his nemesis. But if we can get some Protoss eliminators in the lower bracket, that would be ideal. Because remember, we started this tournament off we started this stage of the tournament off with, I think it's 4 separate Protosses, right? It's Hapsea, the Shambler, Hamster, and General Anakin. Meanwhile, we had Art of Turtle, Taco Cake as Zerg, and Nebulime as Zerg, and then Newt as Terran. So definitely a Protoss dominant bracket. For the sake of the matchups, I'm hoping that Newt makes it past Taco Cake, and I'm fairly confident, but Taco Cake has been practicing against Hapsea's Protoss and against EUD's Terran, and they played a lot of matches, so I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do with a little bit more knowledge. Remember, Taco Cake did defeat TopRamen, although they were weird, cheesy games, so maybe not much to write home about in that respect, but he was able to defeat him in battlements. So you got to say maybe Taco Cake can make it happen, but I'm not sure. I still think Newt is a really strong player. It would be quite a surprise if he exits winless in the throne room stage, but Taco Cake could be the guy to do it, right? He should definitely be able to take a game. I'm not sure that he can take the series. I predict 3-1 Newt. Although I think Nebulime told me it was 3-0 in his prediction, but that was maybe before he knew. I don't know if he knew that Taco Cake has been practicing as hard as he has. So that's going to be played, I think, Thursday. And so that'll be cool to see. The same is true for the Art of Turtle General Anakin match that will also be played Thursday, whereas Hamster and Nebulime, I think, is tomorrow or maybe Thursday as well. Who knows? But anyway, we'll get through all of those games as we can. Art of Turtle versus General Anakin, I'm not 100% sure who comes out on top of that. I kind of think it'll be a 4 or 5 game set. 4 for sure, but 5 game set otherwise. And I feel like it'll be Art of Turtle narrowly squeezing by. But General Anakin is so aggressive, and Art of Turtle actually has shown a little bit of weakness to that, both against the Shambler and against Hapsea. So, General Anakin is not on the level of those players in terms of the early game micro, but he's pretty fearsome all the same. And really, I actually think maybe his micro is on the level, maybe even better than people like the Shambler, but his real lacking is the macro department. So if you can just hold on and use Defender's Advantage to your advantage, and you'll basically guarantee yourself that you'll be able to be good to go. Also, apparently, if you GG very late, then you will tilt General Anakin. That's something that the Shambler told me. So that's kind of funny. All right, so that basically covers that. If things go the way that I'm expecting them to, I think Hamster will narrowly edge out Nebulime, but that's a really tight match, and I could see it going either way. I hope we'll get a really nice banger of a series between those two. That's what I hope. On the Hapsea versus the Shambler side, I actually don't know how to call either of these series, to come to think of it. The more I think about the Hamster versus Nebulime thing, the more I think about recency bias. Nebulime has gotten Hamster's number a little bit more recently, and Hamster hasn't been playing that much because he's been struggling to defeat the final mission of UED Commander's Brood War alternate, which I helped to create, called Unthinkable. So it's quite unthinkable that he's not been playing Cosmonarchy that much, although he did practice against the Shambler today, so maybe he'll be a little bit more warmed up, although I don't know if he's been practicing. I guess he'd have to fight like Taco Cake or Art of Turtle or somebody for PvZ practice, but or Grunch. Grunch would be another option. So who knows? But anyway, I think it's really cool that we're going to have that kind of match, but there's a chance that Nebulime runs away with it if Hamster really is super out of practice. So I hope that's not the case. I hope we get a banger. And Hapsea versus the Shambler. So if people who don't know this, the Shambler is the kind of guy who types, and Hapsea is also the kind of guy who types, and they have typed at each other, and the typing has achieved biblical levels, I'm told. I have not actually casted the games that this biblical level of salt has been stored in, so I don't really know. One day I'm just going to start casting and it'll start radioactively, decaying my atoms, and I'll be like, what the fuck is happening? I'm melting, and that'll be why. So I'm looking forward to that. But that will one day happen, and maybe it'll even be happening in the replays of the upper semifinal itself. So you never know. But that's a mirror matchup. Who knows how it'll go? Hapsea, of course, the one who said that, fuck yeah, of course I'm going to get to the finals. And the Shambler has always said to other people, I look forward to seeing you in the finals, and then he doesn't get there. So hopefully the Shambler can turn his luck around. It would be really funny if this is the match that previews the finals, and it would be quite fitting if it's PvP, right? Because, Protoss OP, nerf toss. Now, if it goes the way the seeding is set up as Hamster seeded over Nebelheim and the Shambler seeded over Hepsea, then that would make it, and assuming also that Newt takes it over Taco Cake and Art of Turtle takes it over General Anakin, the way that I predicted before, then essentially what that would set us up for is the upper final would be Hamster versus the Shambler. That would be an exciting mirror matchup. And then down in the lower bracket, we would say goodbye to Taco Cake and say goodbye to General Anakin, and we would have let's see. Hepsea against Newt. Holy shit. I don't know how to call that one. I guess I'd probably have to say Hepsea. But, Newt is a pretty scary player, and Hepsea has lost to him before. Then we go to Nebelheim versus Art of Turtle. That would be really funny because it would be ZVZ and PVT on the other side, of course. But some ZVZ that Nebelheim is super well versed in. Art of Turtle, not quite so, but a scary macro player as well. So, I don't know. I think no matter who from Hamster or Nebelheim goes down to the lower bracket, they will probably make it past Art of Turtle. And if it's General Anakin that upsets Art of Turtle, I kind of feel like they definitely make it past General Anakin because they won't fall over in the early game, and they are much better at macro from what I've seen out of General Anakin so far. Meanwhile, on the other side, if it's the Shambler, I think the Shambler can take Newt down. If it's Hepsea, I think Newt can take Hepsea down. So that actually does change the sort of complexion of the later stages of the tournament. We could actually see Hepsea get bopped, if double bopped, like back to back, if he can't make it past the Shambler here. So it's a match that does actually matter. If Hepsea can defeat the Shambler tonight, then I think he stands a pretty good chance at least making it to the grand finals, if not in the upper bracket, then through the lower. But it's pretty exciting to see how it'll end up going down. I would love to see what ends up happening anyway. So with all that said, that is the preview, and I hope you are excited. I certainly am. I love these kinds of tournaments. I'm really glad to have another one back. And you can see the difference it makes. So many people active playing the game. Great to see that. So shout outs to all of you. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about some balance adjustments. In the balance adjustments, I wanted to just cover the fact that I am definitely going to be reducing the mineral cost of the Eidolon by 25 minerals and the Shaman also by 25 minerals. I don't know that this will make a massive difference for either of those units, but it should mean that you can combine them with mineral-heavy units and compositions that you're building if you wanted to combine the Shaman with something like, heavy Goliath production, for example, or even like mass vultures. And you could definitely combine them with like mass bio, right? If you think about Mavericks and Clerics and Harakans, now you can suddenly fit in the Shaman a little bit more expediently, and, you can maybe fit that in alongside Anseals and stuff. We'll see how it goes. And besides all of the work that I've been doing to try to understand why people aren't building a lot of bio, why people aren't spamming Eidolons, dude, they're so good, along with Cyclops, I really have to wonder what other changes we'll end up making in conjunction with that. Because I know that EUD has been playing a lot of Terran, really trying to make bio work, and he says that he feels like maybe mech is just the way to go. It's like a must-have in all matchups. I actually think that bio works out really, really nicely when you combine it with drops, and I'm not sure if EUD has been doing that. In fact, I don't really see anybody playing Terran like I play Terran, which is just to play a lot of drops. I've beaten Newt that way, and he's a pretty, top tier Terran at this point. I haven't played against EUD, so I don't know how he's like. I also haven't really played that much lately at all because I've been so busy building the thing and working on the other stuff that I've been doing. But still, very exciting stuff nonetheless. I definitely want to see what happens with those minor changes in. Let them simmer, let them cook, as the kids say. See what happens. Beyond that, though, I do think that there's some more stuff we can talk about. Here's the exciting stuff that I've been sort of debating. I think there's a very strong chance. I guess before I even move away from that, the Cyprian will almost certainly get +1 weapon range in the next major update. And the reason for that is I don't think that the abuse cases that I was initially fearing will actually show up that much when we factor in map-based changes that remove buildable tiles from central ramps. Not the ones that are in your main, obviously, but still the ones that are like in the middle of the map. As well as the general abandonment of the idea of like overhangs that help you use cliff advantage to defend your natural choke. That neither of those will be factors in future competitive maps. So I feel like that's going to be a significant change and improvement in how the worrying about any sort of high range unit on a cliff, particularly anchor Cyprians, where they go from 6 range to 8 range in the anchor to 10 down a cliff. and then now you're talking about adding 1 to all of those breakpoints. However, this will allow them to do some pretty nice work versus Drakidins, versus Goliaths, and generally be a little bit better at what their role is supposed to be, which is like, mid to high range fire support. The higher end of mid, I guess you could say, because Mavericks are kind of like the middle end of mid or lower end of mid or something. So that's a big deal, I think. But the most exciting thing that I'll talk about with regards to balance today is the Ultra Core and Gorger Core changes that I'm considering. So you guys are all familiar with how at the end of Ascension number 7, we had, in the aftermath of that tournament last year, we added the Vornath Pond and the Skibacked Scab. And those units, those nodes, those intermediate steps for Zerg, allowed them to go straight to the tier 1.5 at the cost of, if they went for a longer game and they got to tier 2, they would be talking about having to pay extra on top of what they've already paid in order to upgrade to the Tethvith Swamp to access the other 2 units, or to the Kalkir Lake to access the other 2 units there. So in order to fully use it, to fully justify it, you'd probably have to get a significant amount of power output out of the stuff at tier 1. And then if you do go to tier 2, not need those units. Otherwise, it's not the end of the world, but you haven't been as efficient as you would have liked, right? So it's an interesting choice to stagger the decision for when you make your army more flexible. But it came at the cost of you could no longer just build a structure and then immediately make a flying unit. That's not true for the Gorger Core, and the Gorger Core has had to be reined in a lot from its original incarnation when it was able to defeat a lot more stuff. Things like, it could 1v1 a Goliath back in the day, despite costing about the same. That was back when the Goliath was more expensive, of course. Now, it's not quite so powerful. I think it's underutilized, but I feel like it could be more exciting and fearsome and stuff if it were not enabled from a tier 1.5 costing Zerg structure that doesn't actually require any additional mutations. And I've also been thinking that the Ultra Core is an exciting unit as well, but it's kind of impossible to fight with certain compositions, even at equal tier. And I don't know if I feel like maybe it's just underexplored, so it's probably fine. People will figure out a way to fight it. As they become more ubiquitous, as they have more experience with it. But I also feel like there's a lot of overlap with some of the other tier 3 anti-surface options. It sounds weird to say that there's an overlap between the Ultra Core and the Acrimnalisk, but I actually do think there is, because the Acrimnalisk is a sort of base busting, really durable thing. And even though the Ultra Core moves a lot faster, especially when it consumes a corpse, it still is kind of in the same boat of you make this to clear the ground and especially to deal with static defense and whatnot. And I think that's great, but I also think it would be possible to say, what if we reined in their stats a little bit to make them more approachable by tier 3 armies, but we added that intermediate step between the Zorkish Shroud and the Ultrav Cavern. Of course, the Ultrav Cavern would have to be renamed now. And that Zorkish Shroud it would be like the Ulgor or Gorgrol. No, I guess it would have to be Ulgor, right? Something like that. It would be like the Ulgor Grotto. We already have Gezkath Grotto. I don't know. Ulgor Chasm, something like that. I think Ulgor is like a name of something, unfortunately. So I'll have to think about that. But anyway, that's basically the idea that I have right now, is that what if you had the Ulgor structure that gave you access to Ultra Cores from Zoristoleths and Gorger Cores from Larva, and then you buffed the Gorger Core to make it more exciting, make it more powerful, more potent. You also reined in the Ultra Core a little bit, nerfed that a little bit, but still made it more accessible. And then that intermediate step structure was available from tier 2, so you needed to make the Aral Iris in order to access it. I think then you're in a more interesting situation than you were before, because you have that intermediate step that allows you to more immediately utilize your Zoryu strains, and also to, if you're not going to have access to the Gorger Core at the beginning of the game, does that break any openings? Probably not. I don't think there wasn't that much exploration with the Gorger Core, but nothing is reliant on it as of right now. So I don't think we're kneecapping Zerg's ability to react to a certain thing. If they're dealing with splash, they can go Lakizalisk. If they're dealing with crowds, I should say. If they're dealing with heavy air or any sort of air, you don't really go Gorgs for that anymore. So yeah, it's just a thought. I feel like it's kind of interesting to think about. And so hopefully that's sticking in people's craws, and people are going to think about that all day. Be like, man, it'd be so cool if I could make ultra cores at tier 2 and they weren't so insanely busted. And the other people will be like, man, it would be so cool if, Gorga cores were more useful and interesting. And I saw them more often because I really like their hugs of death. They're flying ultralisks, man. Isn't that cool? And then I hope other people even further go, man, wouldn't it be so great if ultra cores weren't so busted? I would really love to not have to die to them every time they show up. And then I can kind of group all three of those people in and be like, you three straw men are exactly who I've been looking for to man this operation. Let's go. And that brings me to the community roundup. There's not really that much to say here. I welcome some new people, however, because I feel like it's always nice to be able to say, hey guys, we've got some new guys around. So let me just, I have to scroll in for a while. Actually, you know what? I have a better idea for how to accomplish this. So I don't know if this is available to everybody, but I can go to a members list in the Discord server and it will tell me who joined in the last little bit. So let me go all the way back to, 7 days ago. 7 days ago, we had Captain Newbie join. He's actually been trying to help us out with a Discord bot for matchmaking. I don't know how possible that will be, but that's cool. We also had, let's see, I'm looking for some people who have interacted with the project in some way. Say NSC actually popped in. He's a fairly solid player already, which is pretty neat. So he's been playing a couple of games. I can't believe that was only 4 days ago. But yeah, he's been playing a couple of games against Neblime and other such people. Pretty cool to see more action there. We had a guy with Ahmed's portrait, but he hasn't really interacted with the server that much. So it's actually Ahmed's remastered portrait too, which is not as good. And if you click on his profile, you will see some very disgusting things. So actually, it's probably better if we just don't acknowledge that dude. We had a guy named Seeker join. He's actually been hanging out here, playing some co-op and stuff, and with our people, but also with his own buddies back in his neck of the woods. I don't know if they're part of the server or not. If they are, then they're not that involved. I don't know. I haven't seen them. And then I'm looking around to see if I recognize anybody else here. I see Evangelion, which is obviously a reference to Evangelion. I don't watch anime, so I don't know it. But they joined and they've been playing some versus AI and stuff, trying to figure out how to learn the game. In fact, you can say the same thing about the next person, Spark, with a 4 instead of an A, who's also been working on, they sent me some voice previews, so I'll check out that, and maybe we can get some more voice acting in the game that isn't just me. That could be exciting. But also they've been playing a lot of games with some of the people and playing versus AI and such. I don't know if anybody else popped in. Oh, Jujic or Jujik also popped in here, and they had some very strange issues setting up the game, but we found them, fixed them, and now we can be more informed if anybody else has those issues. And they've been playing the campaigns and stuff. So there you go, community roundup, just to shout out some names of people who have popped in. And of course, we're going to continue doing this over time. I figure I might as well throw that out as recognition for new members who have popped in here. Might as well. I can also give an honorable mention to Fartbag XP, who types with an emoji every single time they send a message in the chat, either in the Discord server or in my stream. How are you, dude? Hope you're doing well. Wuck cigar. What a guy. I didn't see any maps posted for recent history, and no videos or tier lists posted either, which is a damn shame. So get on that, guys. But I did work on my own rotational symmetry 4-player 1v1 map, and I'm excited to get people's opinions on it. It's called Iron Lung, and you can check it out in the CM Maps channel of the Discord server and tell me what you think. All right, that will cover it. So you know what time it is now, boys. We are going to start answering some coffee questions. In the bottom left of your screen is a link that takes you to a web page where you can send money to me and Veek. 7, that is. Any other numbers after Veek are probably an impersonator, aka Chris Metzen. And that's a really deep joke that I don't think anybody other than Veek himself will get. So what is this whole thing about? Well, I kind of already explained it in the show intro, but we take money as payment for services rendered, as donations towards further development, and so on and so forth. And what we are going to be doing with that money is, acquiring more productivity materials such as coffee, and also to just pay some bills when we need them for whatever reason. It's very nice, actually. I was able to pay for a game recently that I'm going to be playing with my brother, and that's not exactly tangentially related to development, I guess, but maybe I'll get some ideas for it and from it, and I'll be able to turn that into something related to the game. But that's just some of the a small example of what your money goes towards. Padding my lifestyle. I don't actually. I live pretty sparingly generally, so it's nice to be able to afford extra stuff here and there, in large part due to the generosity of viewers like you. Thank you, actually. Myrian is coming in from the top rope with the first question. I swear he's always the first guy to react or respond to the question threads. So he's definitely a loyal donator and member in that respect. Appreciate you, dude. And so he asks a question about trade in Xibalba. For those who don't know, Xibalba is my bespoke setting for sci-fi games and such. It's basically where my magnum opus is planned to be made, and it's very exciting in that respect. So I think that's actually why Myrian joined us to begin with, actually, is that he really liked the setting and he liked the ideas that we were planning for our original games and stuff. And he's since been hoodwinked into the whole StarCraft project. And he's definitely been, enjoying what little he's been playing of that. So he's aware of it. He's recognized it, but he's also very much eagerly awaiting the further exploration of the original content, which I'm always a fan of. So I appreciate people like that. He asks, how much trade is conducted in Xibalba between the regencies in terms of resources, arms, mercenaries, technology, etc.? So this is kind of interesting. There's certain regencies, which is our term for races, basically, or controllable factions, I guess. Certain regencies have no trade going on between them. Obvious examples would be like, you wouldn't really call it trade with the Rune and their victims. It's more like they've been ambushed and ransacked, raided, etc. Although there are some alliances that people form with the Rune as like an attempt to manipulate them or whatever. There's some similarities between the Rune and the Warhammer 40k orcs, except the Rune are not fungus. But the idea, they're a little bit more intelligent than the orcs as well. But they're very they have a one-track mind. They're all about like conquest and being achieving glory through war and stuff like that. And they are also very like creatures of excess to some degree. Not in the sense of like gluttony, although I guess that does play a part in it, but you wouldn't know because their metabolism is so fast. But essentially the Rune are like, people have constantly tried to, manipulate them because they view them as like stupid. And then they are regularly surprised when, yeah, they're stupid, but they're actually like, in some ways, they're more simple than even like the manipulation gave them credit for. So like they'll go from saying, like, say you were trying to, for example, like one event that has absolutely happened that maybe we'll chronicle in like a campaign or something is when like the Psychora attempted to manipulate the Rune in a way where like the Psychora like elevated extra dimensional entities and stuff. And so like you definitely think to yourself, oh man, these guys are super smart. And they're pretty savvy in that respect. And so they attempted to manipulate the Rune by pointing them towards like a big horde of resources. And those resources were actually not really that important to the Psychora. And so they were fine for the Rune to take them. The problem is the Rune took them. And then immediately after that, we're like, all right, well, now we're going to take yours. Cause that part's done. Part A is done. Part B, my hidden plan, not really that hidden, is just to attack you now because you've got stuff too. Right. And so like, they were almost like dumbfounded by like, but like not that they expected the Rune to have honor, but they just assumed that like after they would fought this bloody war in a collaboration with the Psychora, that they'd probably be like maybe tired or maybe just happy to get out with what they had and so on and so forth. And then instead they're just like, no, we're moving on to the next war, and it happens to be right here. So yeah, the Rune are pretty funny. Some people will trade with them, I guess, but it's like it would be like food or whatever. They're not gonna. The weaponry is not really of interest to them. They take trophies, but they don't necessarily get trade. Like if you gave them something, they'd probably see it as more of an insult because it's like, well, you think I can't just take it? So that's sort of the Rune. Obviously the Githrovan, the Sunspawn, the ideas, the benefactors or the, what would you call it? The inheritors in some ways of the mantle of judgment, of command. These guys are like the ones that try to bring about a peaceful universe. They're not going to trade with their misbegotten creations, the Solar Throne. They're definitely not going to trade with like the Rosellium. They have a general distaste for inanimate objects, or I guess unconscious objects, unconscious regencies. And they probably won't trade with Gadamemter either, because they don't really have much respect for Gadamemter for other reasons. I mean, they recognize that it's not really possible to negotiate with Gadamemter. Same with the Orlithrae, actually. But the Sunspawn do still want to preserve some aspect of them. It's just, they don't want them to be... They'd prefer them to be locked away in a zoo somewhere. And actually, Gadamemter can agree with that, funnily enough. So there's some common ground, at least. But yeah, so like there's certain things that like certain Regency combinations, basically, that you won't see any real trade relations. The Ensifi are happy to trade with some aspects of the Embraceet, but it should be noted that a lot of the Ascosi-led or Ascosi-dominant Embracethi sort of guards or clans or whatever, those units are often like characterized as raiders. The same is actually true for so a lot of the early tier Embraceet relations, like the factions include things like the Retons, for example, are like these. I've described them as like instead of the humans being hairless apes, these are like hairy apes in some way, but they're still like hominids, right? And I haven't decided if I want them to have 4 arms or 2, but they're going to be like pretty. They're going to kind of be similar to humans in some way, right? Like a mammalian type of idea, and the Retons are all about this idea of like, they just spread like wildfire, man. They fuck like rabbits. They're crazy in terms of their population. So that's basically their superpower. And you will absolutely see like hundreds of them die in like the first, I don't know, I want to say like 10 minutes, but maybe that's even too low an estimate. I'm not sure. Anyway, the Retons and the Ascosi are happy to just go all the way with their ridiculous raids and stuff. And they're constantly scavenging and they're constantly looking for better things. In fact, it's the Retons who actually created the basically like the drones and stuff, like the sidecast, the what is it called? I think it's there's like a term for it that I had somewhere, but I think it's like the Otini or something like that. Yeah. So the Otini are basically these like service droids that are maintained by the Retons, and they're basically like scrapped together in some ways. I mean, they follow like shared schematics, but it's kind of like the Blackjack for Cosmonarchy Terran, where they're just sort of made out of like leftover parts. So I've speculated before that like having a Blackjack variant where like all of the metal tones are like slightly different, or like there's like extra panels and plating and stuff here and there. We decided not to go for that because it's such a small sprite that it would be kind of busy, and you maybe would think that there's like something actually different about this unit. But that was like one of the ideas that I had for like as an example of that. And so maybe the Otini type units will be like that, right? So that, yeah, the highway, the sidecast, these are, basically these are like similar types of ideas. The handle is actually like that as well. The handle is the worker for the basic worker for the embassy. So anyway, I'm saying all of this to explain that like these raiding types of races within this coalition they're not exactly respected by the other regencies. If the Ascosi the Ensifi were trading with like the Riliar, the Perilli, the Totaran. These are like the other more, I guess you could call them high class regencies. Although the Riliar is like a little bit different. The Riliar are like, the Riliar are highly sought after because they have pretty, useful technology. The Dauterans I haven't actually decided what kind of tech they're going to have. I know they're going to be the most expensive and like the most powerful options by and large for the Embassy. And they're also like essentially the founding and organizing member. And they're probably going to have a lot of like psychic powers is my thinking. So I don't know that their technology will be that widely spreadable and tradable. The Perilli are also kind of in the same boat though. The Perilli don't have a crazy amount of psychic powers. It's more that they have like an affinity for engineering and stuff. But their forms are so diminutive compared to, like, they're not like super midgets or anything, but they're not very stocky people. And the Ansifi are obviously very stocky by comparison, right? They're tall, they're very like thick muscled. All of them look basically like bodybuilders in many respects. Like they're ludicrous in terms of their physique if they were a human. And so anyway, it's worth noting that like a lot of the tech is like kind of fashioned for that. So most of the trade that you'll ever see is definitely more on the supply side, like food and raw materials and resources that you harvest. So alliances mostly trade in that. And then like more friendly things, you will sometimes see like weaponry, change hands. Mercenaries is a good question. There's a whole mercenary subgroup of the Embersethi tech tree. So there's the agency, and the agency is where you request the mercenaries, at least at the first couple of tiers. And so there's the disgrace, which is a Keltar unit, obviously disgraced from some Ken somewhere. And then there's the professional, which is an Ansifi unit. The Dateron, which is sort of like a rogue. What would you call it? Like it's a dossier from the Makral Das, but it's been like it's been recontrolled or like reconfigured in some way. And then there's the roguelite, which is a funny name. Rogue as in ROGUE, and then light as in light switch or whatever, not light as in LITE. So the roguelite is a reconfigured and reprogrammed, if you want to use that term, Rosellium drone and stuff like that. So there's Embersethi ideas for the mercenaries, and they do pool from other regencies and such, and in some ways just have like recovered technology or whatever. So that definitely I don't know that there will be mercenaries in the actual tech trees of the other races, though. I want to mostly keep them kind of holistic, and that's from like an RTS design standpoint. But in lore, like in the campaigns or whatever, for example, in the Psychora campaign, your primary antagonist early on is this character who is leading the Daybreak Mining Guild, and that's an Embersethi organization. But they have under their payroll an Ansifi mercenary squad known as the Santis Sons. It's like a whole mercenary fleet. So yeah, there are mercenaries like that, absolutely. But it's like a whole fully fledged Ansifi faction if you were fighting them. It's not like, the Embersethi use a couple of Ansifi units, which they also do through the agency, but that's not like what you would see. You wouldn't see like a couple of shared units for like the Makral Das, like using some Orlithray unit or something like that. You wouldn't see that, right? So hopefully that all explained it. You have to kind of have some reason for why they don't commingle in that way. And in reality, I would imagine they definitely would. It's just like, when you're dealing with these military campaigns, you're dealing with these well-oiled military machines, and they really can only rely on themselves most of the time. The Embersethi obviously being a very adaptable race by comparison. So there's the answer to that question. Let's go on to the Shambler's question. He asks about the crimes of Protoss trained at the Rogue Gallery. This is probably, in some ways, it's been a topic of conversation that's occasionally come up in the casts that I do with Neblime, but I imagine it was also prompted in some small way by the Protoss tutorial, since the Shambler did complete that. He asks more explicitly, what are the specific crimes of each type of Rogue Gallery / prostration stage unit that they had to, that they had to commit to earn their sentence, and how does it play into their powers? So I guess another way to put it, a Mind Tyrant is a fallen Cantavis, a Pariah is a fallen Amaranth, a Sycophant is a fallen Legionnaire, and a Potentate is a fallen Ecclesiast. Well, I guess I wasn't really sure if the Charlatan should be the fallen Ecclesiast or if it should be the Potentate, but I'm pretty sure... Oh, wait, maybe I got this wrong. I think the Potentate is... Because the Herald is also... we basically have multiple uses for the core units, right? So, like, Zealot, Ecclesiast, Legionnaire. The Zealot, the Fallen Zealot is turned into the Dracodon. The Fallen Ecclesiast is turned into the Hierophant. And the Fallen Legionnaire, like I mentioned, is eventually becomes a Sycophant. And so Fallen, in this case, could mean that they were killed, but during their service... maybe they committed some kind of crime, and that's what the Shambler is talking about here, or maybe in their personal life as well, right? If you have done a great job with yourself as a Legionnaire, you maybe You may return to combat as a herald. You may return to combat as an aurora. And so those are two examples. Although I might decide to redesign the herald when we have a custom graphic for it to be like a more bespoke unit, similar to how the Amaranth isn't like a fallen zealot or something. It's just its own elite warrior, right? Kind of like the what is the Archon? Well, that's probably like a justly fallen Amaranth, right? So like if you've fallen honorably, you'll be, you might return to the combat zone in different ways. Like the Amaranth also may return as an Atreus, for example. But if it did something unjustly, then you'll absolutely see it return as a pariah instead. And so you can kind of see the differences there, where like the Atreus is crowd control, the Amaranth is shield steal. And the Atreus has like the splash damage, right? So it returns as like a splashing type of unit. That's also pretty stocky and sturdy. But if it was, doing something unjust, if it was committing some kind of crime, then you'll see it return as a pariah. And the pariah is also crowd control, and it's also sturdy and stocky, but it's also melee. And so it must endure pain in order to, complete its sentence. And, that feeds into like the voice lines that it has and stuff, and all that stuff, right? The Archon, by the way, maybe we can just stick to the Cantavis as the source for that. I actually wasn't really fully thinking about the Archon and the Mind Tyrant, since if I had the ability to, I would just redesign their visuals entirely. I don't really think that... Some people will disagree with this, in the same way that I was talking about the Zerg being very different in my understanding of them, and the Chrysalian version of the Zerg is very different than the StarCraft 1 version of the Zerg, and maybe that's like not for everybody, and I'm totally fine with that. I actually don't think that the Archon and the Mind Tyrant are very Protossy. They're just balls of energy. It doesn't really feel like they're that exciting or interesting to me. I know that in StarCraft 2, they try to make it more like flaming energy, but that feels more, I don't know, that just feels like angelic inspired stuff. And it doesn't really feel proper to me anyway. So I would probably just completely change how those units look eventually, and we wouldn't use those graphics anymore. But, the Cantavis may return as an Archon, and you can imagine it's like channeling its storm powers in order to do that. And otherwise it may return as a... I guess it would return... You know what? The Cantavis would return as a Charlatan, right? Not a Mind Tyrant. The Mind Tyrant would probably be something entirely misbegotten, like some kind of very heavily fallen unit, right? Like, oh yeah, by the way, the Vagrant, if it falls and is like committing a crime, we talked about, the Legionnaire committing a crime, becoming the Sycophant. You could probably interchange that with the Zealot, actually, and then the Legionnaire maybe would be better as a Vagrant, right? So these aren't like exactly answers to the question, because he's asking about like specific crimes. So the Vagrant is guilty of nihilism. That's where its passive comes from. And when Protoss give up on the great journey, as we can borrow from Halo, the commencement, right, as it's actually called in Chrysalian, when they give up on the commencement, that's considered nihilism, which is actually a crime in Protoss society. And the Vagrant then is someone who has been, sentenced to carry out its final sort of act, and it will obviously, this is like a death sentence, right? All of the sentenced are sentenced to death in one way or another. However, the sentences are very different, right? So they don't necessarily play into their powers per se. In the case of the Vagrant, their penance for being nihilistic is that their life literally does not matter. And in some ways, you may even want them to die as the player controlling them, right? As the commander commanding them. So their sentence isn't necessarily related to their power. It's more like, I guess in some ways you could definitely construe it that way, but it's more like their punishment is related to how they work. And so the Kabbalist is obviously they are trained as an assassin in some way. So they're actually a bespoke unit. They're not like something like a Zealot or whatever that, turned into it. You might think that, the Legionnaire, because the teleport. No, there's not actually a connection between the two. But instead, the Kabbalist is like, they've killed another Protoss, and not in a combat scenario, right? And so they, obviously, in order to defeat a Protoss in some way, you have to undergo a certain level of conditioning and a certain amount of practice and a certain amount of poise in order to take out a fellow Protoss. And so you have to cross some Rubicon, and doing that is already against Protoss societal ethics and mores, but it's also like proof positive that you are an adequate assassin, an efficient assassin. And so your sentence is to use those capabilities. The same sword that, by the same blade that you felled a fellow Protoss, you will also put that blade to work on the front lines, and that will be your contribution, your way to repay that. And so you do that until you die, but you don't have to die. Like the vagrants, when they're deployed, they basically die. Like technically they could return, but like in practice, they pretty much never do return to the gallery, so to speak. The Charlatan, being a fallen Cantavus, I think makes plenty of sense, considering the hallucination stuff. Their sentence is to, presumably there was some friendly fire incident, basically, with the Cantavus, and their sentence is now to, be put more in danger and lose access to their most powerful spell, which is Psionic Storm. They lose access to their most powerful sort of, I keep calling them spells, but they're obviously powers. This isn't like a magic game or whatever. But you get the idea. So they've been stripped of one of their primary powers, and that is not an ideal situation to be in. Like when I redo the voice acting for the Charlatan, it'll be maybe not somber per se, but they will be a bit more on the muted side. They definitely won't have like the Zerg extra filter on there. That's just a leftover from when they were both Zerg and Protoss. So anyway, there's that. And then the Barghest. So what is the Barghest? The Barghest is actually not really the failure of the unit. It's not like, oh, whatever this used to be was like a mistake or something. Actually, this is what happens when the engineers of the Protoss were attempting to reconstitute fallen warriors into the kind of like blue goop soup that fills the Dracodon. So that same kind of thing fills like Auroras and like it can pilot spacecraft as well as the ground walkers, right, the Striders. So that's where you get like the Aurora as like a fallen legionnaire, right? And so anyway, long story short, there was some horrific experiment that resulted in the Barghest. And it wasn't an intentional, at least on the record, it was not an intentional experiment like that. That was not what they wanted. It was a mistake. However, it has been deemed to be of such profanity that that is essentially capital punishment in Protoss society. As you become a Barghest, you are turned into one of those. Yeah, not a very nice backstory to that unit, but there it is. And I already kind of mentioned about the Pariah, the Potentate. Those are Amaranth and Ecclesiast. Obviously, the Pariah was guilty by like the Nuremberg defense, if you guys are familiar with that, where it's like, I was just following orders. Basically, their crime is one of ignorance and maybe stupidity, where they were led astray. They were led to into a criminal act by somebody else. By the way, that somebody else may have been the Mind Tyrant. Wink, wink. The Sycophant was more like, well, okay, I'll get to the Sycophant in a second. It's kind of ironic. But with the Pariah being led astray, that's where, suddenly the dialogue makes a bit more sense, right? He's saying, oppose me, contest this crime. He's kind of saying the things that he should have said had he not been able to carry out his own will. And so that's sort of like, an allusion to the origin of what the Pariah was and what crimes it committed. Now, the Potentate is kind of an interesting one because on paper it looks like, maybe it's like a cool looking unit. I mean, it's a pretty wacky looking, really. But it's like, oh yeah, this guy, he looks like a proud Protoss warrior or whatever. That's mostly because of an art asset limitation. But also... the Potentate is the only example of the Sentenced where it's actually here to eventually try to redeem itself. And it will do so by way of, leading by example. That's where it has like the optional melee attack and stuff like that. And so if you're able to make it happen with that guy, like basically, if he's able to lead his troop to victory, so to speak, then there is the potential for him to return and be, serve out his sentence without death. He's the only exception to the death sentence rule. The sycophant, the legionnaire. Basically, it's a legionnaire who did not give his life or his limb, as you would call it, because most of them are recovered, right? The way that the zealot is recovered and turned into a Dracoden. It's a case of cowardice. That the crime is cowardice, and so that's why the sycophant is destined to forever provide shields to others, so to speak, right? So anyway, I think that's a pretty comprehensive list. I guess I probably didn't talk about the potentate's crime. It's one of those cases where, again, it's kind of similar to the Legionnaires, but it's like, maybe it's in an attempt to save itself. It focused its energies on a target that was better for saving itself at the cost of some other Protoss's life. You can kind of think of it. So also it's like a cowardice through self-preservation. That's actually a fairly regular crime in the Protoss society. Like, some Protoss are not as strong as they may have initially believed, and so they are often sentenced out. And you can't hide it either in the context of like, they know you're doing it, right? With the whole thought, the ability to see each other's thoughts and stuff. So anyway, there's that. That's the answer to that question. Hope you enjoyed, Shambler. We're going on to Three Crow's question now, and he's asking about RTSs with physics. What? How would you approach an RTS made in a physics engine that would allow for collisions to have effects depending on the contexts? And then he asks he gives some examples of like, if you destroy a capital ship and then its corpse is a pathing blocker that walls off a choke, there's dropping bulky units in a resource area in order to create pathing blockers from town halls to resources. I guess this is like the idea of like harassing your opponent by like blocking their ability to to harvest efficiently or whatever. Ordering your own capital ship to collide with another unit or structure at maximum acceleration. And then he leaves in parentheses, Tassadar really needed some vassals to cover his approach. And terrain deformation as a result of technology, weapons, or collisions. So the baiting a capital ship to a choke thing is actually something I was considering in Cosmonarchy, believe it or not. The only issue is that I think it would be very clunky. But the idea of basically displacing units or doing damage to them based on the collision or whatever, with the corpses leaving behind rubble that could be targeted to destroy, is actually possible in Cosmonarchy. It's just something that it would be a pretty significant mechanistic change that, even though it's possible, I wouldn't actually do it. But I don't think you need the whole like collision system stuff to necessarily make that happen. Unless what you're trying to do is like, I mean, you can still do this without collision. But if you're trying to go a step further and take into account like acceleration plus facing direction, or like velocity plus facing angle, right? To calculate where the final crash is. And then I guess like change the crash. The physics engine part would be like, did it crash into a wall? Then it falls down, then like slides down the wall and like is left by the wall. But did it just crash into the ground? Okay, then it kind of like maybe scatters rubble around a little bit or something. I don't know. I definitely would like to experiment with like flying units of various weights dealing some damage to ground units that their corpses hit. And then maybe like, I don't know, like that would probably be pretty good. I think that would work out. It would be, you'd have to make it so that it's somewhat reliably reproducible. So like maybe they don't take into account the velocity part, because if they did, then it would be all kinds of messed up as to like what happens there. But basically what you're talking about with that kind of change is giving every unit the Aurora passive, except instead of seeking out an enemy target, maybe some of them would, or maybe that would be like a light fighter attribute in general. Most of the time they would just crash to the ground. So, you know, I don't know, like I guess if it's consistent, like it always goes the same distance from the facing angle, like it checks the facing angle and then it always goes the same amount of distance and doesn't care about maximum velocity, then you could play around that, because you would just like position your units around the heavy capital ship, and because it has low turn delay or low turn rate, it wouldn't be able to like look at you. And even then there's like a period of time where it starts to list and move forward, and then you could dodge from there. So I guess it wouldn't be the end of the world if we took into account facing angle. I would not like to take into account velocity, because I feel like that would be really inconsistent, like effectively random is what it would feel like a lot of the time. So yeah, that's the only thing I probably wouldn't include, but I would absolutely think about like the other stuff. thinking about it a bit more. Originally, I didn't think I was going to take into account like facing angle and then moving a certain amount of distance. But if it's consistent, if it's playable, you can play around it. I think that's pretty cool. That could work. I don't know. Like a lot of the examples here were pretty good. I feel like ordering your unit to kamikaze, I feel like could be very perverted in a way where it's like you'd basically be saying, I only want to make this unit to like suicide it, and deliberately like giving a suicide order. I'm not sure that I would like that. However, what's the difference between that and then like ordering like 100 vassals into the enemy base to hopefully like bomb on their workers? I'm not sure. Like, I don't know if that would be very good gameplay, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Like, it would be pretty thematic. It would be a cool cinematic moment or something, but I don't know if I would like the idea of doing that. So anyway, that's just, I guess I have to think more about like what other physics related things would I do. I was thinking that like, if you had a physics system, what you would probably do is like behaviors that are related to like displacement. So you'd have like explosions that are high intensity that like throw infantry and scatter them around. And then you'd have, I guess you might want vehicles to move a bit slower and be bulkier on average so that you could then affect their movement with it. I feel like that would be really clunky and it would end up like Command & Conquer 3. But I guess you might want to try to experiment with that. And then on the ship side, if you had a realistic physics system, the one thing that I've always thought was kind of funny is that like ships can just turn whatever. Like the Centaur is a really obvious example of it, but it's technically possible with all of the ships that are not exactly squares in their aspect ratio, is when you turn the Centaur, like obviously normally if you had pathing or whatever, like, okay, maybe the units don't overlap. But even then, it's like they can just turn. Normally you have to like really slowly turn, and then they'd have different collision depending on like, are they long or are they like facing up? Then there's no collision to their left or right. And are they facing, to the right? Then there's no collision up and down. And so that's like, I would love if there was like an elegant solution to that, but I feel like in general, that's really obnoxious to deal with as a player. And so I wouldn't really want to try it. That's another consideration, is like having different collision sizes depending on the facing angle and like the dimensions of the unit, I guess. I don't know. One thing that would be kind of neat about a physics engine is that you could basically have like weapon behaviors that are also like shrapnel, and then it like, I mean, I guess that's not that different than collision based, like an explosion that like throws, like the Zarkaver core passive, where it takes damage and then it releases spores all over the place, and then anything that gets hit by them. I guess like the physics thing would allow like ricochets, but that would also probably feel really inconsistent. So I don't know. I think it comes down to like most of the things that you can do in a physics system that are off the top of my head, I don't know are great for RTS, but there's some that would be pretty neat. And if you included them, as long as your game was like paced adequately so that you could actually make, account for them, like, and by, I don't mean like the most average baseline, like casual player could account for them necessarily, but it's like, an adequately skilled player could do it. Then yeah, I think that's probably fine. But it definitely would create a different kind of game. And I think generally because of the expensive nature of physics calculations, that would probably mean lower unit counts. And if you have lower unit counts, maybe you have lower like scale in other places too. So I'd probably stay away from it myself, but that doesn't mean that I haven't been thinking about it. So anyway, there you go, 3Crow. Hopefully that answers your question. We're going to move on to TopRamen's question, his second in a row, I might add. And he's asking me a question about RTS games or non-RTS games that I consider to be classics. Yeah, his question is just, what are other non-RTS games you consider to be classics and why? So I did play through all of the, classic in this case, like to define the term, is like a game that has to have been out for, I guess you can have like what's called an instant classic, but I feel like that term is bandied about a lot. So a game that I have a lot of experience with, so we won't put like a release date on it per se, but I have a lot of experience with. We'll say like probably more than 100 hours, right? And it's a game that I look back on fondly, that defined some aspect of gaming to me, even if it's just related to its genre or whatever. And yeah, so I guess that's probably it, right? I have a lot of experience with it. I look back on it fondly, and it helped define part of gaming in video games, like what video games are or could be for me. So like StarCraft is obviously one example, but we're talking about non-RTS games. So I'll say Halo. I feel like I mostly got a lot out of Halo 3 or Halo Reach, but I played all of them. Well, I didn't play Halo 5. It sounds so silly to me. So, okay, when I was a kid, I read Game Informer, and there was a really funny episode of Game Informer on the, like, anytime it would be the April edition, they would always have like a bad writing week or whatever, and that was like April Fools or something. And so they had like this, there was this guy who, like, the shtick of this character they invented was that he would write about games that hadn't come out yet, but as if he was writing from the future. Or I don't know, like, I guess he was also, there's also some element of like, it was obvious the games were fake, and he was like faking the reviews to sound cool because he's like, oh, I played all these games that you guys haven't even played yet or whatever. So anyway, that was the character that they made. I could be misremembering. I was a kid when I read this, but I remember seeing that his favorite games, because they had like an intro, a bio to all these characters, and like one of the characters had like, one of the fields in this bio was like favorite games, and one of his set of favorite games was Halo 4 and 6, and then in parentheses 5 sucked. Now 6 was obviously Infinite, which sucked. 4 sucked, and 5 also sucked. But I think it's funny that from what I've been told, 5 is like the worst out of all of the new ones. I think Infinite is pretty bad. Infinite is 6, for those who don't know. But anyway, I feel like that's probably worth pointing out. So, yeah, I would say the Halo franchise, I guess, back when it was a Bungie game, a Bungie franchise. Sure, we can say that. The reason why is because it showed me asymmetric faction design in shooters, and there's a lot of different weaponry that was really cool, and yeah, it was very much a rule of cool. It was not a very, like, I look back at it fondly because of the experiences I had. I played a lot of multiplayer with it as well. The same for Gears of War 2. I'll add that to the classics. I played a lot of multiplayer in Gears 2. Now, I don't think these are good games, but I do think that Halo 3 and Gears 2 were games that I played a lot of. I did a lot of map editing in Halo 3. Less in Reach, but a little bit still there as well. And built a lot of like friends that, I don't really talk to anymore now, but it was very much like a social experience for me. That was like my gaming social experience. Like, obviously I played a lot of Brood War, but on console it was those on the 360. So I would put those in there. Trying to think if there's anything else that immediately comes to mind. I talked about Imperium Galactica 2 in the last episode of Prototype, and I guess that was probably also a classic for me. I spent a lot of time with it, and it showed me a lot about a more casual genre, I guess, that was still kind of interesting to me. Now, the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting was this reminded me of playing Freelancer, because I played Freelancer at the same time as I played Imperium Galactica 2. So I'll say Freelancer is another classic game for me. It's got ship customization, some like spacefaring, like navigation, and it's got like a funny story that I only beat when I was much older. And I thought, holy shit, this is a funny game, like a goofy ass game. I don't think they intended it to be funny, by the way. But it was cool. It was just like a weird game. Like, a lot of these classic games are like games where I think, like Time Splitters 3 is another one. That's more like a local game. I didn't play that online. That was back in like the PS2 era for me. Or maybe original Xbox, I'm thinking. Yeah, I think it's original Xbox. There's also a game. Okay, I don't know if anybody has experience with this. I was looking everywhere for this like last month. So it's a game from the Dreamcast era. And I think it was either called Fur Fighters, but Fur Fighters is like a different game. Okay, let me just describe the game. I thought it was like Mercenaries or Furcenaries or something like that. And it was like, you played as animals, and it was basically like Five Nights at Freddy's before Five Nights at Freddy's in terms of the aesthetic. Like, you were playing as these animals that were supposed to be kind of like cute or cuddly or like chew toys or whatever the fuck. But you had to like shoot You went on massacres, you went on military operations, you went to hell in this game, I'm pretty sure. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Please put in the comments section if you know what I'm talking about. That was a classic. I played that when I was like, before I was even 10, and I'd love to play that some more. Like, goddamn, I want to go back to that era if I can even do that. I think the Dreamcast emulators are probably a bit scuffed, but anyway, that's something that I still think about that game sometimes, man. And I still think, goddamn, what if I could play that again? Yeah, that was just like, Rayman is a classic. Rayman 2, specifically, the 3D game. I have played the side scroller one. It was really weird. The 3D game, I think it's Rayman 2. That was very creative creature design and environmental design, considering the limitations. Pac-Man World is a classic in a pejorative sense that I feel like it really showed me how games are like that get 3D versions are often very bad and like confusing as fuck. So I would point that out. That was just a zany game. I want to play that again. Pac-Man World, I think it is. I'm pretty sure that's the game. Anyway, there's all sorts of stuff like that. Yeah, I guess there's some games there for you. Again, I don't know that any of them are actually good, but I do think that a lot of them are like, for the time that I grew up in and the kind of games that were available back then, what I got out of them was like, here's a conception of what games could be. There's like some part of it is like social stuff, like the Gears 2, and like I didn't play World of Warcraft, so Gears 2 and Halo 3 was like my social gaming, plus obviously Brood War, and then some Warcraft 3 in there as well. And then it's like, okay, well, that's what I played. I guess some StarCraft 2, but not really, not very social. That was like the tail end of it, I guess. And then obviously after that, I was like League, and that was it. Counter-Strike, I guess. And I don't play any of those games now. So if I look back at like the single player experiences I had, like Time Splitters 3, Freelancer, Imperium Galactica 2, and Rayman 2, and there was one other that I threw in there just now. Oh, that Mercenaries game or whatever that I don't know the name of. I hope somebody can tell me because I want to try to look it up again. Oh, and Mech Assault, the Mech Assault 1 and Mech Assault 2 games. These were games where it was like they all had their own internal idea of what they were going to be, and some of it was kind of like rushed at the end or whatever, especially Freelancer. But they let you do your thing. They didn't really like get in the way and try to like micromanage you every step of the way. You just kind of figured it out, and you had like this really weird worlds, all these weird settings to explore. And I only played Time Splitters 3 multiplayer, but by myself versus bots, so I don't really know what the single player is like. But it was definitely really wacky. I think I played some split screen as well. So I don't even know what the setting is about. But like you got to experience like these really strange scenarios, and it helped define what games could be for me, in that they didn't have to be like really basic story games. They didn't have to be Final Fantasy. They didn't have to be Pokemon. They didn't have to be Legend of Zelda. They could be really strange. They could have their own, you could have your own voice in your game that would really shine through. And you also had like a lot of very different gameplay genres, but a lot of these are very focused around their gameplay. Like Freelancer is pretty focused, as I recall, for its gameplay. And the same is true for Rayman 2. Like some of the gameplay here is like kind of tight. Some of it not so much. Imperium Galactica 2 is very like it's a 4X game, so it's like a bunch of different things. And then there's a couple others in there that aren't so good, but I still think it was like, for me anyway, it formed this idea in my head that you could make games and have them be pretty different from each other. And they're all still games. So I guess that's worth something. There you go. Lucifirius asks, what's your favorite day of the week? What's up, dude? You always ask such like low scope questions, and I appreciate that, especially as I'm coming to the end of this episode, and I've already talked for an hour and a half. So I appreciate you, Lucifirius. My favorite day of the week is probably Saturday, because that's most often either Fraud Night Day, UMS Night Day or whatever. Back in the day it was Mod Night Day. Now it's also Tournament Day. And I'm never working my shift work for that day. So I'm always available to do some Cosmonarchy work and also to play some games. So that's my favorite day for sure. But I also really like, Monday and Tuesday these days, because I'm also working on like the devlog and like finalizing the stuff for, preparation for podcast recordings and stuff. And that's always fun. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I like those days too. But yeah, mostly Saturday. Definitely like the standout. But I like all my days, dude. It's always a good day to be a Cosmonarch. And then Jesse over here is going to close us out with the last question. He asks about meaningful choices in RTS campaigns. So you know it's going to be a banger kind of question. So here's his question. What are your thoughts on how to add meaningful choices to RTS campaigns? StarCraft had the battlecruisers or nuke silos choice. He's referring to UED Mission 5. I guess Mission 4 was when you made the choice. Mission 5 was the reaction. That's the Brood War Terran Mission 4. You chose which to do. StarCraft 2 added planet order and unit upgrades. So that's mission order, the order of missions that you take, and then also you can like upgrade your units or change them or whatever. Is there a better way to give players agency that matters between scenarios? So first I'll answer this from the perspective of Cosmonarchy, and then I'll answer it a little bit differently. If I was just designing, if I was deliberately designing a different experience for single player than I was for multiplayer, where there's no expectation that single player will have similar like tech trees or experiences to multiplayer, because that's not true in Cosmonarchy and generally not true in my work. But if I was going to do it that way, I'll answer that separately. So that'll be like the second part. So the first part, from Cosmonarchy's perspective, one of the ways that you could give players agency that matters between scenarios, and I think that you can do this no matter what, this just happens to also be applicable to Cosmonarchy, is you can keep track of player decisions and their compositions and how much trouble they have in the game leading up to the whole, like the next mission or whatever, and like how long did it take them to clear the previous one? Was the AI a pushover, or did they almost die? Stuff like that. And I think you can use this to inform adaptive difficulty, which normally is said in a way where it's like, hey, you suck at this game, so let's make it easier. I would never make it easier. I would only ever make it more challenging, or at least more varied, I guess I would put it that way. And so what this means is if you defeat, say, an enemy that shows up again in the next mission, and the way that you defeated them is with, like, say you're playing as Protoss, and you do a mass zealot strategy, and it overwhelms them the first time, and you win the game, and the mission only takes, like, I don't know, 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and it's just like 10 gate mass zealot off of 2 bases. And it's like, okay, that was easy, and I didn't really have to do too much. I didn't engage with most of the game, right? Well, the next time you face that enemy, what you might find in a world where we log that information is that, say they're Zerg, well, after they go for their pool, like their hatch into pool, maybe they go immediately to Zorkis and build a lot of Lakizilisks, and suddenly you've got crowd control to contend with. And they didn't do that in the previous map, and they wouldn't have done that in this map if you hadn't beaten them with zealots. So I don't know that we'll get to achieve that in Cosmonarchy, but that is one example of, like, I don't know if you would even call it adaptive difficulty, but you would just call it adaptive enemies. You'd definitely be able to call it that. So with all of that said, I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the ways that people think about this sort of the player agency changing stuff between the scenarios thing is like, it's a bullet point to add to the marketing box. I think that's how a lot of people conceptualize it. So it's always something that exists, that it doesn't have anything to do with like the modality of the game. So you playing an RTS is kind of secondary to the conception of what changes are made. So like, at least in the StarCraft 1 case, you make a decision in the map that ends the map in a way that is different with the rest of it. And they programmed it very poorly, and they could have done a lot better. The other thing, by the way, that they did in StarCraft 1 is the Brood War Zerg campaign, Mission 3, lets you infest command centers, and depending on how many you infest, you get that many command centers in the next mission. And they did that by duplicating the same map like 5 times. So that was, or 6 times, I guess, because there's 5 potential command centers you can infest. So that's silly. Anyway, that is kind of a separate issue. If they wanted to do something more like, you can do something to give yourself better assets starting off in the next mission, then they probably should have come up with something else for that. And if they wanted to change the available tech or strategies that your enemies do, StarCraft 2 did this kind of in the lead up to the final mission in Wings of Liberty, where you have a branching path for which mission you take to limit what the Zerg can do. So you can either destroy their Niduses, which is way more impactful than destroying their air, by the way. And it's unfortunate because the air mission, the mission you take to destroy their spires to knock out their air units, is like way more of an RTS mission than the fucking micro hero adventure you take in the pits of Char. The pits of the one where you clear it through the Char one is just like, it makes the mission way easier basically for most people's playstyles, I guess. Maybe there's like, I'll leave an asterisk there because maybe there's some playstyle that like trivializes the Nidus stuff, but it makes it really hard to hold from the air. Anyway, that's worth pointing out because like there's the idea that you're doing something in the mission and that's changing the outcome in the next mission. But I feel like that could be generalized to you're interacting with an enemy and that enemy is studying you and then preparing a response next time, which is more analogous to how you would play, multiplayer. And it doesn't all have to be related to multiplayer, but it all has to be related to playing an RTS in my mind. And like the RTS gameplay that you're doing is supposed to be actually what is happening in the story. So I mean, that complicates some things, but I feel like when you think about it from that standpoint, it hopefully shades in more context. If I was going to make it so that I don't care as much about the granularity of RTS gameplay into this, like what the story is, then in that case, I would probably, like if I'm thinking about a more StarCraft or Blizzard or mainstream approach to this sort of thing, I think the better way to give players agency that matters between scenarios would be like bonus objectives. And maybe I'll still play around with this in Cosmonarchy and other games. But bonus objectives would essentially, they might not even be referenced as like things that you should do per se. At least not in the objectives menu somewhere. But they would be logged. And so you might see like, oh, hey, you should go defend, you've got an AI ally. Well, if they die in this mission, if their forces are eradicated and they are defeated, they're routed, then in the next mission, you don't have them as an AI ally. And if they survive, then the next mission, you do have them as an AI ally, right? Like that's a pretty basic one. Maybe there can be something where you are, and this isn't related to an objective, and it might not even be a net benefit, by the way, but like if you decide to win a mission, like say your objective is to defeat a specific enemy and there are two other enemies in the area and at least one of them survives. Well, whichever one survived that mission might still be there in the next mission. And actually I planned a lot of this for the Xibalba RTS games where there's always like FFAs going on in those and between all the different factions. And so if you don't completely destroy them, then they're still there as like a fully fledged faction. And if you completely rout them, or you like destroy them partially or whatever, then that like changes their starting strength in the next mission or whatever. So I was always planning stuff like that. So I guess under that prism, looking at it through that lens, I feel like that's probably the best way to do it is like, you just have these things where it's kind of natural to imagine what the knock-on effects of them being there or not being there mean for the next mission. And so unless you're making the mission objective always eliminating all enemies, then you only have like the ally line of like, okay, well, if my ally survives, then I still have them in the next mission, or I have them at full strength in the next mission relative to them like having to reroute, regroup, and then redeploy with a smaller force. So yeah, I think that's probably the way to do it. Have it be driven by AI allies and stuff. I'd probably still do that, AI related stuff like which players are active. And also, like I was mentioning, like, maybe there's like, some neutral technology you can reclaim or salvage or whatever. And if you do it, then, you have it and that's fine. And if you don't do it, then maybe the enemy has it in the next mission. But that feels more like an objective or like a mechanic. That should be something that happens in the mission that you're playing and not something that gets saved for later. Like, if you were to rescue battle cruisers, in the Delarian shipyards in the second UED mission of Brood War, then your enemy should also be able to do that. They should be able to refuel, rearm, and reactivate them, like repair them, get them out of dry dock, etc. And that should be something that you fight over in that mission, not something that needs to be worried about when you go to the next mission, I guess, is what I'm getting at, right? So, I don't know. That's sort of my thought there. But it is an interesting question. Always cool to talk to RTS design. There you go, sir. That brings us to the show outro. Next week, we're going to be continuing the recaps and previews of various stages of the Throneroom stage, I guess various rounds of the Throneroom stage, going into round 2, casting that this weekend, and then talking about round 3 after. There are 4 rounds to this, by the way, so we will see how many we get through in the next week. Maybe by the end of April, we will actually be fully situated with this tournament, but I feel like it's probably going to take the first week of May to conclude. We'll also be continuing Zerg tutorial progress, balance adjustments, and growing the community, getting past that 500 frauds number. So stay tuned for that milestone to be hit. And thank you, sirs and madams, for hanging around. GG's.